much, Josie. Our next presenter is Mary Moore. Mary is a lifelong reader and learner. She has worn many hats in the literary landscape, from book reviewer to bookseller. She holds a bachelor's degree in English literature and history from Butler College and a master's of letters in the book history and techniques of analysis from the University of St. Andrews. She's currently pursuing her PhD in literary history at Ohio University, and her academic interests lie at the intersection of history, literature, and critical disability studies, with a focus on the history and literature of eugenics, reproduction, and children with families. And her presentation is The Human and Xenogenesis. Let's welcome Mary.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm gonna keep an eye on the time as well. So, in Zakiya Iman Jackson's Becoming Human, Jackson writes that liberal humanism's basic unit of analysis, man, produces an untenable dichotomy, the human versus the animal. I would argue that the animal could also stand in for the other, and thus a more perverse dichotomy remains. In a world of literature and subjectivity where this untenable dichotomy drives difference between people lies the context of Octavia E. Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. Famed science fiction writer Butler published her second of 3 science fiction series while her career still climbed. She would not win the MacArthur Genius Grant until 1995, but she published the Xenogenesis trilogy in the late 1980s. Dawn in 1987, Imago in 88, and Adulthood Rights in 89 would eventually be bound in an omnibus edition entitled Lilith's Brood in 2000. And while some scholarship refers to the series under this omnibus title, in this paper I will use the term Xenogenesis to refer to the trilogy. These novels follow a set of humans abducted from a nuclear war-ravaged Earth by a set of extraterrestrial beings known as the Oankali. The Oankali have plans to preserve their species by interbreeding with these surviving humans and essentially creating a new sort of being. The novels thereafter follow the descendants of these interbreeding enterprises. As Butler's popularity and literary eminence grew, so too did the scholarship examining her work. For the past 30 years, scholars have utilized queer theory, feminist theory, and emerging lenses of Afrofuturism and Black studies, among others, to examine the roles of gender, race, sexuality, and post-coloniality in the Xenogenesis trilogy. The field of scholarship that most interests me in regards to these novels, however, is posthumanism. To make sense of Xenogenesis and the concept of posthumanism, it is first necessary to define humanism, which is a school of philosophical thought that emerged during the European Renaissance in reaction to the religious moral authority that had dominated medieval Europe. In the development of this philosophy, academics and scholars wrestled with the development of meaning in a world away from religious origins, and instead placed it in the hands of supposed rational or enlightened individuals. The development of humanism eventually led to the coalescing of these ideas of man, considered which contain qualities that are universal and shared among all human beings. These ideas of the universal human or man are exactly what Jackson addressed in Becoming Human, when she points towards the untenability of a human, non-human binary. Posthumanism, in contrast, emerged as an ideological theory in the late 20th century. Unlike humanism's assertion that the human has some sort of moral high ground, posthumanism instead challenges this notion that humans are and always will be the moral agents of the world. This philosophy pushes its followers to consider what could be beyond human, or to consider how the humans that we are today are actually post-human when considered beside the humans of yesteryear. Donna Haraway's famous Cyborg Manifesto, composed in the 1980s, is a useful tool to understand the significance of this post-human discourse. The beauty of Haraway's manifesto lies in its perceptive ability to summarize the human tradition so cleverly. By writing that the tradition of the reproduction of the self comes from the reflections of the other, Haraway indicates to her readers the essential paradox in defining a human, given that it can only be defined by the existence of the other. These words are then echoed directly in the theory of writers like Jackson, but also in the fictionalized novels of writers like Octavia E. Butler. In regard to Butler's work, scholars have come to consider Xenogenesis emblematic of the role of the posthuman in science fiction. Examinations of posthuman figures can be seen in various chapters of several different combined works, like the Bloomsbury Handbook for Octavia Butler. And in some of this most recent scholarship, arguments have been made to consider Xenogenesis as an effort to abandon anthropocentrism and to go beyond these human-centered notions of subjectivity. Under this model, the characters of Xenogenesis are emblematic of this sort of new humanity in which the original human has been displaced by the post-human. Where my analysis differs, however, is in Butler's use of this human post-human paradigm. Building off of scholars like J. Rowe, who suggest that Butler's intended takeaway for readers of the series is that humans must overcome our fear of difference, I argue that what makes Xenogenesis so interesting is not necessarily that Butler's characters embody a post-human ethos. Rather, that Butler uses her fiction to define the category of human as an entity in perpetual change, making the designation of post-human superfluous for Butler's interests. Though the assertion that Butler asks readers to envision themselves as members of a kinship group that includes all living things, human and non-human, is not necessarily disproved by my analysis, I offer an additional explanation for Butler's interests in the bounds of humanity. This paper seeks to demonstrate that the characters in Xenogenesis are written in part to illustrate that Butler's interest lies not in the creation of beings that are no longer human at all, i.e. post-human, or beings whose reproduction leads to pure human extinction, but rather in a demonstration that the category of human has always been a category of change and evolution. To most effectively examine the lives of human characters in her novels, Butler juxtaposes with the alien species, the Oankali. The Oankali have rescued the protagonist Lilith and other humans from this nuclear-ravaged Earth, but go on to treat them as nothing more than an unusual animal. The fate of these surviving humans as they are altered and changed drives the plot of this trilogy. Faced with genetic engineering at the mercy of the Oankali, Lilith tries to rationalize her fate, processing her new reality in passages like this. She was intended to live and reproduce, not to die, experimental animal, parent to domestic animals, or nearly extinct animal, part of a captive breeding program. Human biologists had done that before the war, used a few captive members of an endangered animal species to breed more for the wild population. Was that what she was headed for? Forced artificial insemination, surrogate motherhood, fertility drugs and forced donations of eggs, implantation of unrelated fertilized eggs, removal of children from mothers at birth. Humans had done these things to captive breeders, all for a higher good, of course. In this passage, Lilith acknowledges the long history of humans intervening in the reproductive processes of other humans, including anything from chattel slavery to eugenic experimentation to the invention of in vitro fertilization. Butler reveals that Lilith has come to understand that her future as a human under the control of the Oankali will result in medical interventions that may horrify her, but are ultimately not unfamiliar to the human society from which she has come. Despite this acknowledgement of a legacy of human engineered change, Butler also allows Lilith a wide breadth of suspicion and hesitation towards a future of alterations out of the hands of fellow humans. Lilith longs for another human with which she could commiserate because only another human could reassure her, or at least understand her fear. Butler uses Lilith's concern to highlight the significance of this key exploration. Though Butler may be invested in demonstrating the human as an ever-evolving figure, as Jackson and Haraway demonstrate, the members of the West have historically been very invested in a static version of the human. This static version of the human is one to which Lilith and the other human characters met as the novel progresses are particularly attached. If Butler's human characters are hesitant or resistant to a humans as change model, she writes that the Oankali aliens to be a species quite literally with opposite convictions. Genetic engineering, we do it naturally. We must do it. It renews us, enables us to survive as an evolving species instead of specializing ourselves into extinction or stagnation. The Oankali character Jediah explains to Lilith in an early portion of the first novel. Butler considers this concern of a fate of extinction or stagnation particularly poignant, given that the Oankali have rescued Lilith and the other humans from a nuclear war-ravaged Earth, a planet upon which no humans would have survived at all if not for Oankali intervention. There is also something to be said about Jediah's assertion that genetic engineering is a natural process among the Oankali, given that engineering is an innately intentional skill. By framing the Oankali's self-perception around a species of evolution and change so positively and so instinctually, Butler has created a species that contradicts Lilith's attachment to the veracity of a static human figure. At the end of Dawn, the Oankali character Nikanj reveals that they have impregnated Lilith without her knowledge. Lilith, whose firstborn and first child are critically not among those retrieved by the Oankali from Earth, retreats in horror. But this child won't be human. It will be a thing, a monster. Though the Oankali have altered Lilith and her other Earthborn human comrades over the course of the novel, she critically still views herself as human. Her gestating child, however, Lilith considers at this point in the narrative arc to be closer to Oankali than human. To Nikanj and the other Oankali characters, these distinctions are unimportant. This tension around the bounds of what is human drives the next two books. Adulthood Rights follows the child of Lilith's pregnancy from the end of Dawn, who goes on to be named Akin, and Imago follows the later child of Lilith's named Jonas. As Butler uses these hybrid human Oankali characters to explore the bounds of humanity, she relies on Lilith as a sort of original human to whom other characters turn to for reactions as these interspecies dynamics play out. Moreover, in the final pages of Dawn, Lilith comes to the significant conclusion that if she were lost, others did not have to be. Humanity did not have to be. In this passage, Butler stresses the allegiance humans have to a static form of humanity. Butler uses the latter two novels to illustrate Lilith's character evolution away from this binary sort of thinking as she comes to a more enlightened understanding of humans and change, particularly as juxtaposed against resisting humans who reject this evolutionary model. Lilith's hybrid children, referred to as constructs within the developing society of Xenogenesis, force Lilith to reevaluate her loyalty to a purity of humans. The crux of the second book, Adulthood Rights, focused on Lilith's son Akin, who despite physically appearing as human to those born on Earth, features even more Oankali characteristics than those modified in adulthood, like Lilith. Lilith herself has already faced the consequences of no longer being purely human. In Dawn, she laments that the other newly awakened humans were afraid of her, afraid that she was not human or not human enough. By the time the events of Adulthood Rights take place, these pure or unaltered humans consider Lilith to be the betrayer, the destroyer of treasured things, or a tyrant. To these unaltered humans, which we might consider unenlightened, Lilith has turned her back on the preservation of their species. Lilith's experience of hybridization is not one without conflict, however. With these first altered children, like Akin and his siblings, Lilith loved her children, yet she felt guilty for having them. Her dissonant feelings eventually find resolution as she embraces this interspecies lifestyle and goes on to encourage other unaltered humans to, like her, join with the Oankali and have children of their own. Lilith's embracement of hybrid reproduction and adulthood rights begins to illustrate this change in opinion, in which Lilith comes to view change as necessary for survival. Albeit a secondary character in the plot of the trilogy's final book, Imago, Butler crucially uses Lilith, relevant in her role as the protagonist's mother, to conclude this arc of rejection to embracement. The Oankali mating process with humans involves a sexual encounter so intoxicatingly pleasurable for humans that genuine questions emerge among characters in regard to consent. Lilith responds firmly to this assertion, stating that I did have a choice, yes, I chose to live. Butler has written Lilith's sentiment here as measured. It is not so much an endorsement of the pleasure of a hybrid reproduction process, but instead an enlightened acceptance of a new reality. Moreover, Lilith's acceptance that a static human is a futile pursuit should not be considered one of resigned cooperation. Rather, towards the end of the trilogy, Lilith assures the Earthborn mate of one of her hybrid children about life under this evolutionary regime. I'm content with these people more than content. In this manner, Butler has written Lilith to be an embodiment of both human transformation herself, but also a champion of change in others. Over the course of Xenogenesis, Butler utilizes other characters to demonstrate a vision of this evolving, ever-changing human species. One of Lilith's Earthborn partners, Tino, overcomes his own uncertainty because he wanted to have children, to have at least part of himself continue. For Tino and Lilith, the desire for the proliferation of even some human characteristics overrides a loyalty to a pure human Earthborn humanity. Other Earthborn humans reach similar conclusions, stating, what we have will continue, part of what we are will go to the stars someday. That seems better than sitting here rotting alive or dying and leaving nothing. How can it be a sin for people to continue? Faced with extinction, the Earthborn characters of Xenogenesis are forced to let go of falsehoods, like a preference for hybrid children that physically appear human, and instead embrace a reality in which humans are ever-changing. Butler strategically utilizes one of Lilith's hybrid children to push back against a definition of human as changing, however. She writes the protagonist of Adulthood Rights, Akin, as an ally towards the group of Earthborn humans most resisting to the Oankali interference. Throughout this novel, the reader follows Akin's adolescence as a construct and his ultimate decision to convince the Oankali to send a group of Earthborn humans to colonize Mars without Oankali alteration. The seed of this decision comes from when another construct points out to Akin how it is because of their very existence as hybrid children that unaltered Earthborn humans will eventually cease to exist. When met with human incredulity towards his offer of a Mars colony, Akin explains, "They would never offer you Mars. I offer you Mars because I am part of you, because I say you should have one more chance to breed yourselves out of your genetic contradiction." This genetic contradiction Akin refers to is this Oankali name for the human propensity towards a hierarchical society that they interpret as the source of human nuclear doom. But more significant in this statement from Akin is the assertion that he is part human, indicating an acknowledgement that regardless of the outcome of a Mars colony, some sort of human existence will continue in the human Oankali hybrid societies. In contrast to the alliance of her child, Butler writes the ultimate resolution of the trilogy in Lilith, by means in which her character comes to conclude that an evolving human is necessary so as to not re-annihilate the species. Lilith once tells Akin that human beings fear difference, humans persecute their different ones, yet they need them to give themselves definition and status. In this passage, shrewd readers of Butler come to realize that a human species in perpetual change means a species of perpetual difference. Therefore, it is not that Lilith has a desire for humans to breed themselves out of the human contradiction, but rather an acknowledgement that a static human is a constantly moving target, where the always shifting and molding category of human contorts itself such that it is always in its rightful place above the non-human other. Lilith astutely understands this, what we might call the true human contradiction, of a human constantly in motion. Her understanding allows her to give grace to the other Earthborn humans who have not yet reached the same enlightenment. She knew what the resistors thought of her, of any mated human, as a traitor to humanity, but she never seemed to hold it against them. Lilith has faith that other humans will come to acknowledge that humanity has always been and will continue to be a shape-shifting figure. Though writing about Butler's entire body of work, this excerpt from Jerry Canavan's Octavia E. Butler captures the heart of her exploration in a human as change phenomenon. Quote, "The central philosophical insight of Butler's life is that survival is not necessarily the same thing as defeating your enemy, or even fighting back or standing up for yourself, but simply means that you, and crucially your children, have continued into the future," end quote. Repeatedly throughout the Xenogenesis series, the survival of her human characters, and that being their proliferation into the future, hinges on their ability to evolve, change, and adapt. By arguing that Butler's writing indicates the human is a figure of perpetual change, I reject the need for a category of post-human regarding Butler's work. The post-human model relies on an understanding that pure humanity will at some point, or has already become, extinct. Butler's writing indicates that not only has there never been a pure human figure to go extinct in the first place, but that the future of humanity relies on its capacity for infinite reinvention. Thank you.